I like poetry a lot, but when I think of the word poetry, my first thought is still of the stuff that everybody read in high school, the kind of poems that make us not want to read poems. But hopefully you've encountered good poetry, the kind that, with an unexpected line or a unique phrase, connects you to something new, something bigger, something important that you never realized was important. Poems like Diving into the Wreck by Adrian Rich or Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rainer Maria Rilke. Today, we're looking at the story behind a poem like that. But even if you don't like poetry, don't skip this episode just yet, because this Chinese poem from 2,000 years ago is unique, and uniquely relevant to this podcast in that it tells us about the myths and legends that were important to the poet's audience, in a very particular style, and for a very particular purpose. And the way it does that, well, you'll hear all about it. Join me, Jaer Christie, as I explore the hidden legends that shape the world on the Mythographist, Myths of Mainland China. Questions of Heaven. The stone walls of the tomb are cold. Drops of water cling to the polished gray rock. Carvings stretch from one end of the chamber to the other, telling the grand story of Pangu dividing the heavens from the earth. This is a holy place, a place filled with memory, heavy with reverence. The tomb has few visitors these days. It is midwinter after all, and the climb is not easy even in summer. But despite the long journey up the winding mountain path, today one man has made the trek. His hands are empty, but the burdens he carries are heavy, and written plainly upon his face. His fingers trace the lines across the stones, images of the great gods, and ancient words that told their tale, carved reverently long ago. Though the world was wild, the gods were here, and it was they who set the order that all people followed. This story, he sees as he looks between the words, tells of simple things, the power of the gods, and how everything came from nothing, the darkness and light arising from... Who was the storyteller who first sang this song, he asks, his question as simple as the story. Who was witness to the birth of the light, and who set the boundaries of the sky or the foundations of the earth? So many come here, when the weather is better, and gaze upon the story. Yes, they say, Pangu crawled from the egg, so it is written. Yes, they say, Fuxi and Niwa lifted us from the clay, so it is carved. Yes, they say, we know the answers, but they do not know the questions. The divine order, the man murmurs, and he thinks of the king he serves, the city, the palace, the court, the other advisors. He loves his nation, this man, and the king says the same. But the king listens only to those who praise him, and acts only according to his own interests. And all the court praises him and says how richly heaven has blessed him, and they hang meat from their windows even as wolves roam the streets. The man feels his hand become a fist, and he pounds upon the stone in vain. Ruin, he whispers. All will come to ruin, for the king believes his place established, himself infallible, his reign anointed by the heavens. Why does no one ask the question? Why will no one see? How can an ear become deaf to the cries of its own body's pain? And if the eye sees true, how can the sight of such things not compel the body to rise to something greater? How can one who witnesses their own misery and pain choose not to try to change their situation? It is here, he says, and his voice shakes. It is all here. The answers are plain, but first we must ask the questions. Tears fill his eyes as he fumbles with the brush and the bottle of ink in the pocket of his robe. He may be hushed in court, perhaps he will be exiled from the land that he loves, but no longer can he remain silent. Perhaps, he thinks desperately, furiously, planting the seed of one question will lead to the blossoming of another. To whomever may be listening, he cries, "Is this the plan of heaven, that we bleed ourselves dry for those who would cast us aside as refuse?" And, trembling, defiant, his brush dances across the shrine's wall. What are the laws of the sky, he paints upon the austere stone of the tomb? What is fixed in this universe of motion? Where do the heavens end, and where is the road that will lead us there? Line after line, the poet scrawls his questions. Questions about the heavens, questions from the heavens, questions to the heavens. The answer is the question, he pants, kneeling on the floor, his ink and his strength both spent. And the question is the answer. Oh, that we would be blind to neither. This story is based on a poem called Tianwen, and it's the wasteland of the Chinese literary tradition. By that, I don't mean an empty, barren place, but the equivalent of T.S. Eliot's masterpiece, The Wasteland. Its title translates to Heavenly Questions, or perhaps more accurately, Questions of Heaven, and it's 186 lines of richly elusive, paradoxical questions that reference all sorts of early mythology, legends, and history. Tianwen is collected in Chuse, an anthology of works from a number of different authors written just before the Qin dynasty, so sometime around 215 or 220 BCE, just before the first Qin emperor established his dynasty and unified China for the first time. It's the kind of literature that's significant enough that everybody learns about it in high school, but most people probably don't really connect with in a meaningful way, and so they never really think about it again. Although the authorship of the various poems in Chuse has never been definitively established, and probably never will be, this particular poem is often attributed to Yuan, an advisor to the king of the Chu dynasty. There are a few translations of varying style and age floating around out there on the internet, and if you're interested in any of this, I'd strongly recommend looking it up. The one that I found the most clear and poetic was by Mark Obama de Sanjo, which is linked in the episode description. The legend behind Tianwen is what you see here. A poet supposedly went to temples and tombs and shrines and scrawled lines of questions, possibly heretical questions at the time, on the walls, and then somebody else, or maybe the poet himself, collected all those lines and wrote them down in one place. This poet, poem, event, it's closer to you than you may think. It's obliquely referenced in a whole bunch of modern media, including the lyrics of Pink Floyd's song Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun. Interpretations of the what and the why all that happened, however, are all over the place. The full poem contains references to dozens of characters and stories from all sorts of myths, some of which we've already covered in this podcast and some of which are completely lost to us now. Some scholars say that the poem is a simple collection of legends. Others think it's a shamanistic catechism or ritual, and still others believe that it's primarily a philosophical work. However, based on the socio-political context in which it was written, it makes the most sense to me that it's a political protest, as I've shown in my telling of the story, and that it was in fact written by Yuan, or at least someone with the same opinions as him. Yuan was exiled from the Chu court after speaking out against his king's repeated acquiescence to obviously hostile nations. After his exile, Yuan spent several years traveling and collecting the folktales of the lands. Tianwen seems to me as though it's asking the reader to make an obvious conclusion. The gods aren't in charge, we are. There's no justice, there's just us, to quote Ghetto Priest. But doing this without explicitly stating, "Hey guys, it's time we got rid of this divine mandate nonsense and got ourselves a king who's interested in running the country well," which probably would have gotten him killed. This also lines up with the style of social commentary that appears throughout Chinese literature. With that interpretation in mind, I find it kind of funny that about 300 years later, Han Dynasty scholar and literary critic Wang Yi answered all of the questions in Tianwen very matter-of-factly. I'm not sure if it would be funnier if he spent so much energy completely missing the point, or if he was doing all that he could in a similar situation to propagate the book under another tyrannical king. Yes, this is definitely a real dragon we're talking about here, not a metaphor for anything. There's no reason to burn this book, but you should probably read it. Oh, and this also isn't the last time you'll hear about Qu Yuan. This outspoken poet is the focal point of the story behind Dragon Boat Festival, which this year, 2023, falls on June 22nd. We'll cover that story next week. I'll close with a few biblical parallels. On one hand, Tianwen's unspoken thesis, anyone can figure this out if they want to, sounds an awful lot like the Old Testament prophets, as well as the Apostle John. He who has an ear, let him hear. On the other hand, it also shares a lot of similarity with Job's questioning of Yahweh, screaming questions about the origins of the universe into the void. But, unlike where God answers Job, Tianwen ends without an answer from anybody at all. Instead, it seems that the questions themselves are the answers. Here are the closing lines of Tianwen, as translated by Marcobama de Sanjo. I have been prevented from telling the honest truth, but Chu is about to fall, and will not last long. How can one admonish the king, and make him welcome an advisor's sense of right and wrong? Thanks so much for listening. This episode of The Mythographist was written, narrated, and produced by me, Jaer Christie, with research by myself and Elena Tung, and music by Xiaoqing Luna Li, and from the compilation The Essence of Famous Chinese Folk Music. If you liked this episode, stick around, because there's lots more where this came from. Subscribe to get notified automatically when The Mythographist updates, and be sure to check out the rest of the episodes on your favorite podcast platform, or on YouTube. Finally, if there's a story that you grew up with that has shaped the way you see the world, I'd love to hear it. We all have so many stories to tell, and the more we hear, the more we'll understand each other, because we can't learn if we don't listen. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on The Mythographist.